Hinko Smrekar, also known more formally as Henrik, was born in Ljubljana in Slovenia in 1883, the third of 4 children. But an earthquake in the region in 1895 destroyed the family home along with many others, and they subsequently moved to other locations, eventually settling in the town of Kranje. Despite his obvious talent for artistic expression in childhood, in 1901 he enrolled at Innsbruck Law School in Austria. After a couple of years there, he realised his mistake, abandoned law studies altogether, and set out to follow his artistic instincts instead. As he had not had any previous formal art education, he took various drawing courses to improve his skills, and in 1903 he joined the Vesna Art Club, where he found himself among other creative souls, including the writer Ivan Kankar. And following his first, somewhat unpromising image for Kankar's book Madame Judith in 1904, they forged a friendship and went on to work together again in the coming years. In 1905 he started to create illustrations for the satirical magazine The Wasp, and it served as the perfect platform for Smrekar's irreverence and general iconoclastic nature. He created a large series of bleakly comical works executed in a heavy brutalist style, with tonal greys created by the use of various hatching and stippling techniques, which satirised many of the less attractive aspects of cultural, political and religious life in the country. Admittedly, the meaning of many of these images is lost in translation, but others speak a more international visual language and span the continents and decades with enduring eloquence. But even as he produced this torrent of satirical monochromes, there were other examples of his creativity in evidence, including this astonishing pen and colour wash image titled Tale of the Sorrowful King, which unfortunately I have no meaningful information about. There were more sober, less harsh images created to accompany poetry too, and Smrekar gained a strong reputation for creating caricatures of everyone and anyone, from his circle of friends through to the great and good of the time in the region. And even if we have no clue who they might be, we can still admire them, if not for accuracy, at least for their graphic prowess. As the first decade of the new century drew to a close, Smrekar continued to produce work for books by his friend Ivan Kankar, political satires which pulled no punches, and less disturbing images such as this engrossing fantasy single-colour monochrome example from 1909, which again I have to confess total ignorance about. In 1910, Smrekar was commissioned to design a pack of playing cards, and the manufacturer was keen that the pack should commemorate Slavic history and traditions. He was only too happy to fulfill their wishes, and he worked on the project for more than a year, creating a series of striking colour images for the numbered cards, which unusually featured similar but not identical images, whichever way they were held. But the face cards followed the accepted convention of mirror imaging. And although popular with his fellow Slovenians, it was also seen as something of a subversive cultural threat by the Austro-Hungarian authorities who had control of the region. In 1911 he moved back to Ljubljana, and he was joined there by his recently widowed mother a couple of years later. Smrekar continued to create generally benign caricatures of his friends and acquaintances, including more of Ivan Kankar, and he even included himself in these little parodies on several occasions. Around this time, Smrekar created a collection of postcards, none of which were comic in nature, and all of them appear to deal with none-too-cheerful subjects, which I assume held particular significance in Slovenian culture. They may have served a nationalistic propagandist purpose, similar to his playing cards, but I confess I'm just speculating. And in 1913 he produced a trio of finely rendered pen and wash group scenes of culturally significant figures from the various branches of the arts and culture in Slovenia at the time. Just as with his other caricatures, I would be very surprised if anyone, even contemporary Slovenians, had much idea who these people were. But despite this inevitability, I for one find myself totally absorbed by the comedic interplay between the various figures who populate the compositions, and the sensitivity of both Smrekar's line work and colour tinting. The The same was true of this equally remarkable and haunting illustration titled Delirium from the same year, which utilised nightmarish creatures, all of whom are gleefully tormenting the distressed and delusional mind of the image's unfortunate protagonist, who bears a striking resemblance to the image's creator. And a particularly compelling historical piece for a book of Serbian poems which never saw the light of day. But his continued and increasingly vitriolic satirical images were seen as a real thorn in the side of the authorities, even before the war in Europe eventually erupted, and his work was frequently censored. And not long after the war did begin in 1914, Smrekar was thrown into prison for a few months after making one too many drunken comments about the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph. On his release, he did create some satirical work for a short-lived magazine appropriately titled World War, but apparently somewhat chastened by his incarceration, he increasingly took to creating limited edition prints to be sold as art to collectors. These prints confined themselves to the realm of the imagination and as such were fascinating, if disturbing, works of graphic art, all of which made considerable use of sinister and surreal visual metaphors with unsettling results. And although he had been called up to serve in the military reserve, he was found to be both physically and mentally unfit, and consequently left to his own devices rather than being sent to fight and probably die for a regime he couldn't abide. In 1917, even as the war continued, he was commissioned to illustrate the story of the legendary Slovenian strongman and smuggler Martin Kapan, written by Fran Levstik in the 19th century. Although the protagonist was entirely fictional, he had become somewhat of a national hero in Slovenian culture, and Smrekar produced a colour cover and a dozen tonal monochromes for the book's pages. The book wasn't published until just after the war had ended in 1918, and it was a rare example of Smrekar working in a less histrionic manner with elegantly composed narrative illustrations, bereft of his more usual nightmarish fancies. Nevertheless, the nationalistic patriotic theme of this publication was well timed to resonate with the citizens. And it wasn't until the end of the war was actually in sight that he allowed himself the luxury of more contentious subject matter, most of which did not attack those in power directly, although it has to be said when he did let loose it was with both barrels. In 1919 he published one of his most significant works, his own written and drawn account of the turbulent years of his life during the war. It was an early example of an adult comic which sardonically detailed his experiences in jail and an asylum, and his various run-ins with the authorities over his dissident actions and sympathies. It was titled Henrik Smrekar, Home Guard Soldier, and the combination of inky illustrations, handwritten texts, and mercilessly candid autobiographical narrative was considerably ahead of its time. It was also in that year that he produced this stunning pen and watercolour image titled The Land of Cocaine, a reference to the medieval mythical place where peasants were free to indulge in their every whim with abundant carnality and gluttonous indulgence. Smrekar's visualization was remarkably complex and panoramic, and defied the viewer to get bored, drawing them into the various smaller scenarios taking place within the overall composition. But in 1920 he succumbed to a severe nervous collapse and spent most of 1921 trying to recover in a sanatorium near Graz. But his condition worsened and he abandoned work of any kind while he was admitted to and released from any number of other psychiatric hospitals. It was 1924 before he was able to start work again, and when he did it was obvious from much of the work he created that his mental state had not improved at all. This was a collection of coloured woodcuts, each evoking one of the 7 deadly sins, and they were undoubtedly among his most disturbing offerings. Smrekar's despair at the negative aspects of the human condition were only too clear to see, and although each close-quarter character was created with great aesthetic consideration, the harsh grotesque nature of the images made far from comfortable viewing. And it's hard to imagine who would have thought they were just the thing to display in their sitting room. The series was eventually completed in 1927, indicating that his mental condition was keeping him from greater productivity. and it would not have done much for his bleak state of mind that this was also the year his mother died. During this period he also created a few other images, some of which were in the form of more limited edition prints, and he did continue to produce generally good-natured caricatures of specific people and more generalised humanity. But this more disturbing reflection on mental health, titled Madness Rules the World, gave an all too clear indication of his own prevailing outlook. But it was also in 1927 that he started to work for the magazine Nettles. And as he had with the earlier Wasp, Smrekar found another natural home for his dissident opinions and scathing indictments of society at large. Over the next 4 years he was a permanent fixture in the pages of the magazine, and he created around 70 frequently garishly coloured duotone images which were quite merciless in their uncompromising satire of all aspects of life in contemporary Slovenia. Most of these illustrations seem at least superficially to have avoided direct political comment, but I'm fairly sure that this is a none too flattering image of Benito Mussolini, a far from popular figure with Smrekar and his fellow nationalists. The images he produced for Nettles constitute a body of unrelenting, bleakly humorous lamentations of the world and the folly of its inhabitants, of positive medieval intensity, and a level of misanthropy not often seen. As such, they push at the boundaries of what can even be considered to be funny. The only other image I found from this time was this portrait of Marlene Dietrich from the 1930 film Morocco, but otherwise it was his Nettles satires which defined his output and exorcised his demons at this time. And he followed those with another series of arguably even darker corrosive images collectively titled Mirror of the World, published between 1932 and 1933. All of these illustrations reflected the turbulent nature of the political and social landscape across Europe at the time, when Slovenia itself was under the firm controlling hand of both Austria and Italy. And although the references to this tyranny were necessarily oblique out of sheer self-preservation, there were visually coded messages reflecting on the country's almost total lack of self-governance. Like so much of his work, they were unflinchingly disturbing in both content and execution. The quality and expressive nature of his line work was by this point considerably more sophisticated than his earlier satirical images for the Wasp, and he put his increased sophistication to particular good use in this collection of eloquent condemnations. Following this admittedly large undertaking, I struggled to find any verifiably dated work of any kind until the later 1930s, although that could simply be that I didn't find any. But by this time life in Slovenia and other annexed countries had become even more difficult, with Austria now enthusiastically embracing the same ideology as Hitler's Germany, and of course Mussolini's fascism had set the whole unpleasant ball rolling in the 1920s. Smrekar was forced to watch his step even more than he had previously, and for a while at least he immersed himself in less provocative work, with more innocent offerings such as Fran Milczynski's Nettles Little Birds, published in 1937. And you would not have guessed it from the generally benign tone of these images, but in the year the book was published he suffered another serious mental crisis and was admitted to another mental hospital. But he was out again by 1938 and illustrated the book Satires by Gustav Strinša, but the only usable images I could find were the cover and this single sporting-themed example. In 1940 his edition of 7 Hans Andersen stories was also published, and although I did find plenty of evidence, the quality of these images isn't as sharp as it should be, but I figured it was better to show them not very well rather than not at all. Of course, by now the Second World War was already tearing the world apart, and Slovenia had been completely overrun by Mussolini's troops. Nevertheless, Smrekar carried on working, at least to some extent, and among other work he designed this darkly satirical poster, encapsulating his dim view of his species for an exhibition of his work. But he was unable to stop himself from visually and vocally condemning those who had held the Slovenian people down. And in 1942, an Italian military patrol arrested him while attending a march by dissidents, and he was found with incriminating documents in his possession. and following interrogation, he was shot without trial. He was 59 years old. Perhaps more than any other subject I've covered so far in this series, Hinko Smrekar has the dubious honour of providing me with the biggest volume of work for which I could find no date or purpose. But there was no possibility I was going to leave them out, particularly as some are undoubtedly among the finest and most compelling images he produced in his brutally terminated lifetime. It's also true that even among quite a few of those I could date and place, I have no clue what the meaning of many might be. But in the final analysis, I'm not personally that big on understanding or meaning, and in the main simply allow myself to be seduced by the qualities of the image itself. And I hope I can persuade you to adopt a similar outlook in your own appreciation of his memorable body of work.